I remember in early Twitter making comments. There was not a lot of political diversity on Canadian campuses. And I would get some pushback from people who said, oh, what are you talking about? There's all kinds of, I know a conservative, yeah, as if one single conservative was enough. And I increasingly thought that that didn't make sense to me. I knew that there had been international data, international surveys that were being done, but the US, the UK, and elsewhere. But I couldn't find a lot of good Canadian data. So a colleague at Concordia University, Zachary Batterson, who's a data scientist, he and I got together and decided that we would actually do a survey. We applied for and got some research funding from the Heterodox Academy, a US-based organization that was interested in the term. It put on the map viewpoint diversity. And we did a survey of Canadian professors. I would say two things came out of that, right? On the one hand, we found to a certain extent what we expected, that the Canadian reality of political diversity on campus was very little. In other words, to say, Canadian universities were just pretty homogenous institutions. If you ask people to identify on the right or the left, 88% of professors chose that they were on the left. And if you asked who they voted for, it was a bit lower than that, maybe 78 or 80% people voted for kind of left-leaning parties. And we thought we should know about that. And then the other thing we found is that even doing the survey, asking professors a series of questions about these things, maybe about the downside of that. And we are also asking about the extent to which people self-censored, whether they felt they could approach controversial topics, created a huge blowback from certain academics, from certain kind of academics who identified as on the left and identified as activists. They contacted our universities. They tried to get the research shut down. Luckily supported by my university, but it created a huge burden for us to go back to the research office and go back and say, justify the research we were doing. So even just asking, these questions was too much for some academics to put up with. So I think that's kind of two problems. One, there's the problem that it exists. And the second one is that even talking about it is sort of considered to be a political act, which it shouldn't be.
So then how did you get to the parliament?
We did a report that came out with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which kind of showed these details. And again, others were doing similar work at the same time. And then so it was in late 2024, Conservative MP and a Bloc Québécois MP on the Science and Research Committee that was looking into these issues asked me and a number of other scholars to go and talk to the committee. I'm not sure when these videos will come out. I'm actually appearing again before the committee next week, on Monday.
Interesting. I would actually be interested to see what comes out of that. So you showed up before the parliament, and I read the entirety of the report that you and Zachary Patterson wrote about this topic. And I think there's a lot of damning, if I could say damning, findings that you had there. Not that they were totally unexpected or surprising, but it's damning enough. Yes, it weren't a lot of public engagement, maybe even media engagement. Did you get any media engagement since that time over this topic?
On those topics, we did, but I would say it was sadly quite partisan, which is to say right-leaning institutions, obviously like the National Post, but other kind of radio programs were quite keen to talk to us. But the report was essentially ignored by other media outlets altogether, which I think is a sad statement. When we wrote the report, we did not want it to be a partisan document. And in fact, we found evidence that there were left-leaning scholars, when they too touched hot button issues, they too faced kind of political blowback, questions about self-censorship. So I think the report shows something bigger, but the response in the wider media community was to essentially to try to ignore it.
Yeah, not like I'm surprised. On one hand, you embarked on this research and then you faced a pushback. From the article, actually, you indicated that the pushback you faced was first of all, from the online community where they tagged this a right-wing sort of research or
A right-wing talking point.
a right-wing talking point. I try to avoid those kind of mainstream language because it just makes you want to pitch red against blue, but it's okay.
The thing I like in the sense that it's funny and ironic about that kind of critique is that kind of critique assumes that everyone in the audience is going to agree that a right-wing talking point is something to be ignored. If you would say, is this a left-wing talking point? Is that to be ignored, or is that like a perspective? Is that another perspective to add to the discussion? But the very critique that was being made about the research was actually a kind of proof about what we were saying. The people who were making that comment assumed that in the university world, a right-wing talking point, everyone would agree is something to be ignored. And that depends on exactly the homogeneity that we were pointing out.
Yeah, but isn't that sad? Because is going by your article again, you say there were four major categories that you looked at in conducting this survey in addressing what's the role of university. One is to educate. The second is to do research and to advance knowledge. The third that you used there is social justice and societal advancement. And the last point that you raised there is to educate and train people for workforce, which in turn will lead to the advancement of the economic state of society. And generally, you say in that report that both the general society and the professors, they agree on the fact that the first priority is to educate. The second priority, they sort of diverge from there because professors think that research should come second place, and the general public does not necessarily see that as very important on the second order. And then the bigger divergence in your work, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that professors rank social justice higher than preparing students for the future in which we better the economic state of society. I think that's ironically almost irresponsible. I don't know if you agree with that.
Is it irresponsible? I think it fundamentally betrays the nature of what universities are supposed to be doing, which is to educate, to inform, to seek truth, being conscious that that's going to be in some areas disagreed upon, especially in social and humanities areas. So to suggest that a university's role is to promote social justice and to assume that people are all going to agree on what social justice means, to give it a singular political meaning, is to go against the role of universities to pursue truth and to educate. In fact, what it veers into, what it becomes, would never be admitted as this, but what it becomes is a kind of indoctrination. And that indoctrination happens because so many people within the institution assume that or operate from the same assumptions. And I think that would be much harder to achieve if you just had a much more vibrant, diverse university community, research community, where you just couldn't make that assumption that everyone was going to agree on social justice.
So listening to your argument on the floor of the parliament also, one of the questions that came to my mind, and even going by your article, is what's the danger in the homogeneity of thoughts in academia? Is it inherently bad?
I think it is on, especially when it comes to kind of pressing social issues, but really on many research issues. I recently wrote that peer review research is what we do to sort of justify university research as being incredibly valuable. We evaluate it by other experts, right? We get people in the field who have spent their careers learning about a particular topic, evaluating new claims, new articles, new research grants that want to say, what about this? What about this perspective? And our claim to credibility, to kind of a robust knowledge, is to say we subject all these claims to robust peer review, the peer review of experts. And to think that a politically homogenous intellectual climate, which only includes perspectives from certain parts of the political spectrum, to think that that kind of community is going to have excellent peer review on any kind of socially divisive issue, whether it's the housing crisis, the way to solve the housing crisis, should it be market reforms or more government subsidized housing, whether it's the addiction crisis, how best to deal with that, whether it's the nature of criminal justice and the balance between the rights of offenders and the need for the public to have safe streets. To think that a university community, which is so homogenous and so devoid of one huge chunk of the public's opinions on these topics, is actually going to do a good job of peer review, I would say is laughable.